Hello everyone. In this video, it is going to be titled "The Devil Made Me Do It." And it is 10 crimes blamed on demonic possession. Now, this is going to be part of what I'm doing for the Halloween area of this channel, but whether you believe in demons or not, whether you think people stage crimes and or that crimes are not staged, that simply it's the occult or whatever your beliefs, there are some criminals that do stoop as low as to say the devil made me do it, and they do claim demon possession. And it doesn't matter what religion someone has. In order to get out of a crime, it's always easier to just blame the devil or blame the demons. There's quite a few different things that people like to blame things on. But it is part of the way crimes are. And both the Christian and the secular worldviews see demons as maleficent parasites that destroy human goodness. They are, of course, debating a lot over whether or not demons are real or just mental illness, and I'm not getting into that. Some criminals believe in demons, and some even believe in demons so much that they have blamed their behavior on demonic possession. The case of David Berkowitz, which is the son of Sam, is the most well-known example of a serial killer blaming a demon for their actions. In that case, Berkowitz blamed the demon that had possessed Sam, his neighbor's dog. The following 10 cases are nowhere near as famous as the son of Sam, but they all feature murders and the demons that supposedly drove them to kill. The murder of Lauren Landavaso. 13-year-old Lauren was walking with her friend, 13-year-old Michaela Smith, on September 2nd, 2016. The pair was walking home after school along a typical suburban footpath. At some point, the two girls were approached by a young man in a car. The young man was 20-year-old Cody Lott. Lott would later give two explanations for why he did what he did that day. He was jealous because Landavaso seemed to have a boyfriend, and the devil wanted him to do it. Regardless of which one is the truth, Lott opened fire on both girls with a .22 rifle. Smith, who managed to survive the ambush, told police that Lott made eye contact with her first before pulling the trigger. Eyewitnesses also claimed that Lott shot Landavaso first before shooting her again after wounding Smith. At his 2018 trial, Lott repeated that it was the devil that had helped him to plan the shooting. The prosecution stuck with the idea that Lott was mentally unstable and angry over his inability to find a romantic partner. In one of the weirder aspects of the trial, Lott's mother and stepfather sued the city of Wichita Falls, Texas, in order to retrieve the murder weapon. According to them, the .22 rifle that Lott had used in the murder had been stolen from their apartment. Lott was at first found mentally unfit to stand trial and was sent to the maximum security unit of Texas Mental Hospital. Then, in September 2018, a Fort Worth jury found Lott guilty of the murder of Lauren, plus they found him guilty for aggravated assault in the shooting of Michaela. Lott, the man who claimed to have talked with the devil, was sentenced to life in prison. And the next one, the attack on Peter Churm. According to his grieving family, 65-year-old Peter Churm was a beloved father and grandfather. 17-year-old Tommy Smith did not care about any of this, and the only thing he cared about on February 24th, 2015 was getting the keys to Churm's Range Rover. When Churm stepped in to stop the young punk from stealing his vehicle, Smith, who had already been convicted of a staggering 57 offenses, pulled out a knife and stabbed Churm in the head, back, neck, chest, and arms. The stabbing attack was so frenzied that Smith actually snapped the 8-inch knife in two. Smith went on trial for attempted murder in March 2016. Smith told the Wolverhampton Crown Court that he was not responsible for his actions as he had been possessed by a demon on that terrible day. The court, more than likely, did not buy this possession story, but they did take into account that Smith had been previously diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. As such, he was cleared of the charge of attempted murder. He was, however, convicted of grievous bodily harm and burglary. Churm was in the courtroom for Smith's sentencing, despite being blind in one eye and having survived a serious stroke as a result of Smith's onslaught. Rather than jail cell, Smith was sent to secure mental hospital for an indefined period of time. Next up, the failed exorcism of Michael Taylor. Believe it or not, in our secular age, exorcisms are on the rise. Last year, it was reported that the Roman Catholic Church in the United States was seeing a rise in the overall number of exorcisms throughout the country. The Archdiocese of Indianapolis alone received 1,700 exorcism requests between January and December of 2018. Way back in 1974, 1 year after the release of the classic film, The Exorcist, an exorcism was carried out in a sleepy town of Ossett, West Yorkshire, England. The possessed subject was one, Michael Taylor, a 31-year-old married father of 5 children. Most who knew Taylor described him as a cheery fellow, although he was prone to fits of depression now and then. For the most part of these black moods were the result of a back injury that made it hard for Taylor to maintain steady employment. Things began to change in the Taylor household when they joined the Christian Fellowship Group, a local church organization. The previous irreligious Michael began regularly attending church services. One of the reasons for this dramatic change was 21-year-old Marie Robinson, the group's preacher. Robinson convinced her congregation that the power of God could drive out their demons. Outside of these meetings, some in Ossett began to claim that Robinson and Taylor were carrying on an affair. The more Taylor became involved with Robinson, the more his attitude began to change. The once chipper man became easily irritated and foul-tempered. Things came to a head when Taylor and Robinson were found naked together. Taylor blamed this on an evil presence within himself, and a logical and Anglican vicar was called in to perform an exorcism. During an all-night ceremony in October 1974, the vicar and other ministers apparently drove out 40 demons, including the demons of bestiality, incest, lewdness, and blasphemy. However, the exhausted clergymen decided to go home, even though they still believed that 3 demons, murder, violence, and insanity, were still in Taylor. A few hours later, Taylor was found covered in blood, which he claimed belonged to Satan himself. The blood, in fact, belonged to his wife, Christine, whose mutilated body was later discovered in the Taylor home. Taylor was ultimately found not guilty by reason of insanity. Next one up, the murder of Angie Escobar. On September 10th, 2015, a body was discovered inside of an abandoned car in the Whitestone section of Queens, New York. The body belonged to 28-year-old Angie Escobar, who had died after being stabbed some 80 times. The medical examiner in the case found that Angie had been killed 4 days prior to her discovery. Before long, the New York Police Department zeroed in on a suspect, 31-year-old Luis Zambrano of Flushing, Queens. Zambrano was arrested on September 18th after fleeing to Virginia. Zambrano ultimately confessed to police that he had stabbed Escobar with a pair of scissors after the single mother admitted that she wanted to break off their relationship. In pleading guilty, Zambrano claimed that he had been possessed by a demon at the time of the murder. Zambrano also blamed trust issues for his actions. Zambrano was convicted of manslaughter in April 2016 and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Queens District Attorney Richard A. Brown also helped to convict Zambrano of an unrelated burglary charge, which added a further 3 years to Zambrano's sentence. Then the next one up, Mommy is a Killer. Elizaveta Plakowska, yeah, that name's not going to come out right, of Naperville, Illinois, began hearing voices sometime before October 30th, 2012. These voices told, we're just going to call her Liz, that her child and one of his friends were possessed and needed to die in order to find salvation. Liz gave in to these voices, and on October 30th, she killed 7-year-old Justin and 5-year-old Olivia. Justin was Liz's son, while Olivia was spending the night at their family home. The case of Liz involved multiple possessions. First of all, she believed that her son Justin and Olivia were possessed by demons. At the same time, she was possessed by an entity that she called the Black Shadow. Of course, once Liz went to trial, her defense team turned her possession story into a plea of insanity. Dr. Philip Resnick took the stand and testified that the 45-year-old accused murderer had suffered a psychotic episode prior to carrying out the gruesome crime. As the trial continued, jurors learned that the horrific truth was Liz had stabbed her son 100 times and Olivia 50 times. The jury also learned that Liz had originally told the police that any unknown stalker had carried out the murders after breaking into the family's home. Over 5 years after the murder, Liz was sentenced to life in prison after being convicted of 2 counts of murder and 1 count of animal cruelty. She had killed the family dog and the other family's dog on that horrible night too. She is not liable for parole. And a frenzy of extreme violence. Luton, England is a rough place. Earlier in this year, crime studies in the UK found that the city has one of the highest burglary rates in all of England and Wales. Luton is also notorious as a popular home for some of the UK's most fearsome jihadists. As recently as July 2019, a 28-year-old man and a 25-year-old woman were arrested in the city and accused of carrying documents implicating them in a forthcoming terror attack. Luton was the scene of a different type of horror on May 26, 2015. That night, 32-year-old Jason Nelson, originally from Grenada, went to the home of 20-year-old drug dealer Jordan McGuire. The goal was to buy weed. However, Nelson didn't buy anything that night. Instead, he stabbed McGuire several times before fleeing into the night. McGuire managed to cling on to life long enough to die in the streets like a dog. After police arrested Nelson in Trinidad and Tobago and extradited him back to the UK, the ex-con was accused on other crimes in conjunction with the attack on McGuire. In the same night that he murdered McGuire, Nelson also sexually assaulted a 25-year-old female and a 60-year-old female, both of whom lived near McGuire at the Marsh Farm estate in Lutton. Nelson excused his actions by claiming that a demon had possessed on the night in question. It was the demon that had told him to kill McGuire, and it was the demon that made him rape a grandmother in front of her grandchildren. Nelson would later try to claim that he killed McGuire in self-defense, but in October 2015, the Lutton Crown Court sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 27 years. The next one, The Devil on Trial. Brooklyn, Connecticut, is the type of town where murder never happens. In fact, when 40-year-old Ellen Bono was murdered on February 16, 1981, it was Brooklyn's first homicide since the town had been founded 193 years earlier. The guilty party had stabbed Bono more than 20 times with the common pocket knife. The killer, 19-year-old Arn Cheyenne Johnson, went to trial proclaiming the most unusual defense: not guilty by reason of demonic possession. Without the demonic possession story, this would have been an easy open and shut case. Johnson had stabbed his landlord Bono after the pair had gotten into a heated argument, and was then arrested by police who 2 miles away from the crime scene. However, the roots of the case's weirdness began a year earlier, on July 3, 1980. On that night, 11-year-old David Glatzel woke up screaming. He told his parents that he had seen a demon in his dreams, a demon with pointed ears, sharp teeth, and cloven hooves. David called his demon the Beast Man. Given that David was not a fan of horror movies and not prone to nightmares, his parents took his claims seriously. Things became even worse when the nightmares continued, and scratches and bruises appeared all over David's skin. At a loss about what to do, David's sister Debbie asked her fiancé to help. That fiancé was Arn Johnson. The Glatzel family and Johnson decided to contact Connecticut-based demonologist Ed and Lorraine Warren as part of their final attempt to rid David of the Beast Man forever. The Warrens got to Bridgeport diocese involved in the case, which ended with an exorcism. Johnson said at his trial that he had told the Beast Man to enter his body. Martin Manella, Johnson's lawyer, used tape recording of David's exorcism and the testimonies of Ed and Lorraine Warren to support Johnson's claim of demonic possession. The story became an instant sensation and led in the publication of the paperback book called The Demon Murder Case. 2 years later, the book was turned into a television movie starring Kevin Bacon and Cloris Leachman. Although convicted of the terrible crime, Johnson was released 1 month early from prison after only serving 5 years of his sentence. Connecticut authorities supported this decision by calling Johnson an exemplary inmate. And the Devil app. In February 2019, police in Kalamazoo, Michigan released the 2016 interrogation tape of the spree killer, Jason Dalton. Dalton, 48, carried out one of the most inexplicable mass shootings in recent memory. On February 20th, 2016, Dalton, an Uber driver, shot and killed 62-year-old Mary Lou Nye and her sister-in-law, 60-year-old Jonai, 74-year-old Dorothy Judy Brown, 68-year-old Barbara Hawthorne, and 53-year-old Richard Smith, and his 17-year-old son Tyler. In between some of these drive-by shootings, Dalton continued to pick up passengers and drop them off at their destinations. 14-year-old Abigail Koff and 28-year-old Tina Carruthers were also shot during Dalton's rampage, but managed to survive. During his interrogation, Dalton told detectives that the Uber mobile app began changing his personality. He said, "I know you guys are going to have a hard time believing this, but it literally took over my mind and body," Dalton told the investigators. Dalton further elaborated that he saw the symbol of the Eastern Star inside of the Uber app, and the horned devil head regularly appeared on his phone screen whenever he logged on for work. In short, Dalton blamed his killing spree on the fact that he had been possessed by a demon hiding in the Uber app. On Tuesday, February 5th, 2019, Dalton was sentenced to life in prison by the Kalamazoo County Circuit Court, Jude Alexander C. Lipsey. The sentence did not come as a surprise, as Dalton had already pled guilty a month before. There was one surprise, as Dalton remained silent and remorseless throughout the proceedings. Beside the devil app justification, nobody has come up with a theory as to why Dalton did what he did on that awful night. Next up, the Cannibal Killers. It is not easy to horrify the Russian public, but that is what happened in August 2008 in the forest outside of the city of Yaroslavl. Yeah, okay, don't get me trying to pronounce that one either. 4 mutilated corpses were found. The bodies had been desecrated beyond belief. Plus, homicide investigators also learned that the victims, all of whom were teenage boys, had been robbed either before or after death. Still, despite this fact, the sheer brutality of the crime led investigators to believe that robbery was not the motive. The investigators were right. The crime had been carried out by 6 self-proclaimed Satanists. By the way, Satanists do not do this. Not the real ones, anyway. Proclaimed Satanists led by a young man named Nikolai Ogolvayak. Prior to the murders, the gang of Satanists had carried out several animal sacrifices, but felt the humans had to be killed in order to please Lucifer. I'm sorry, I just find that kind of amusing. Therefore, they killed and dismembered the 4 teenagers as part of an initiation ritual, and according to some reports, also ate parts of their victims' bodies. In June 2010, following a trial which was closed to the public due to the gruesome nature of the crime, 21-year-old was sentenced to 20 years in prison on charges of robbery, murder, and corpse desecration. The other 5 members of his group, 4 boys and 1 girl, were given sentences that ranged from 8 to 10 years. In the case of Yaroslav, Satanists caused a stir in Russia, especially since all members of the gang belonged to the country's much maligned goth subculture. The Yaroslav crime also occurred not long before the January 2009 drowning murder of a 16-year-old St. Petersburg girl, which was likewise the work of self-proclaimed goths. One of the Yaroslav killers also claimed that he had carried out the crimes in order to provide Satan with victims. All told, the Yaroslav and St. Petersburg case led the Russian State Duma to propose several legal amendments that would regulate emo websites and bar any goth-affiliated teenagers from entering government buildings and schools. Wow. Yeah, just wow. Okay, and this is supposed to be the strangest case of serial killer Shawn Sellers. At the tender age of 16, Shawn Sellers was a practicing Satanist who regularly drank his own blood. According to Sellers himself, his descent into darkness began at around age 7. However, given his rough upbringing, one could say that Sellers was damned from the beginning. Sellers was born in California to a 16-year-old mother and an alcoholic father, the latter of whom abandoned the family when Shawn was 3 years old. Shawn's mother, Vonda, tried to bring stability to Shawn's life by marrying truck driver Paul Bellafato. The desired stability never came, and by the time Shawn was 16, the family had moved 30 times. Shawn had other problems beside chronic moving. He suffered physical abuse at the hands of his mother and grandfather, while one of his uncles liked to humiliate him by forcing him to wear soiled diapers on his head. This punishment was made worse by the fact that Shawn regularly wet the bed until age 13. All of Shawn's rage and humiliation exploded on March 5, 1986. Wearing only a pair of black underwear, Shawn crept into his parents' bedroom and shot both in the face. Shawn had later stated that he was angry at his mother because she disapproved of his girlfriend and the fact that he had dropped out of high school. Prior to the murder, Shawn had carried out an occult ritual. The murder of Vonda and Paul Bellafato was premeditated. Shawn had stripped down to his underwear to avoid getting blood splatter on his clothes, and he tried to pose his victims in such a way as to make homicide investigators think that it was an unknown intruder was responsible. Such planning hinted at an experienced killer, which is what Shawn was. A year earlier, Shawn had shot and killed a Circle K convenience store clerk named Robert Paul Bauer after the clerk had refused to sell him beer. Sellers never hid the fact that he was responsible for all 3 murders. Convicted and sentenced to death, Sellers remains the youngest criminal ever sentenced to death in America since 1976. While languishing in prison, Sellers found fame as a born-again Christian and the crusader against the occult. At his trial and afterwards, Sellers maintained that he had embraced Satanism after becoming addicted to the fantasy role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons. Sellers, who also claimed that he was at one time possessed by a demonic entity, became a fixture on television shows and conducted interviews with Geraldo Rivera and Oprah Winfrey. These interviews often saw Sellers speak as an expert on Satanism and the occult practices. Which, side note, that's just a joke, because if he was doing all that stuff, he was not a true Satanist. But, TV ratings, what do you get? On February 3rd, 1999, the state of Oklahoma finally carried out the death sentence that it had promised 13 years before. 2 days before death, a petulant Sellers complained in his jailhouse diary that people kept bringing up the 1985 and 1986 murders. I'm amazed at the self-righteousness I still encounter from people who don't even know me. Sellers wrote, "People, for one moment, get your eyes off my own sins and look at your own. You want to harp on something that happened 13 years ago. 13 years. Sellers finished his diary by stating that he had repented for his sins and had served God ever since. So, yeah. There's those. The devil made me do it. Crimes. Apart from the victims that was lost, and I do hope that every one of those victims did find peace in their journey into the afterlife. But I don't know, some of those criminals, they really do make for a good movie. I don't know. But yeah, there's those. So I will see what the next video will entail. It'll be something related to Halloween in some way or another. Have a good night.